Hey guys, it's Jay Calderon with this week's edition of 12-Rounder Radio. Going to give you some quick results from over the weekend. George Groves returned to winning ways, winning the European title with a unanimous decision over Christopher Rebrassi. It was a pretty decent fight. On the undercard, you saw Gamiliafai and Kaliafai also pick up wins. Kid Galahad picked up a win as well on a different card. This is all over in the UK. Lots of great action took place over on the other side of the pond, so be sure to click the link below in quick results, and you can check all that out for yourself. And we're going to get right into the show, of course. This is an interesting time in the career of one George Groves, to piggyback on the results I just gave you. In his fight with Rebrassi, you saw pretty much everything you have perhaps expected to see out of Groves. You saw flashes of his hand speed, his power. He seemed to learn from some of his mistakes, from the Carl Froch defeats that he was coming off the back of course. He pretty much seemed to see everything in terms of the positives. He didn't really rock Rebrassi, who's never been stopped in his career, but he at least had respectable power. Rebrassi stayed in his shell even when he kind of needed a big 11th and 12th rounder, retain the European title. At the end of the day, Rebrassi still knew getting a little too reckless, putting himself out there a little too much could be harmful to him being able to finish the fight and get to the scorecards. You saw the combinations. He had a great jab going for most of that fight. And then you saw the other components of his game that still, to a certain extent, lack. He was still hit far too much with shots that he should have been able to avoid. You saw signs of that when he was a bit younger, a bit fresher, when he was taking on Paul Smith. You saw that against Kenny Anderson, and you saw that obviously against Carl Froch. And he gets hit with right hands fairly regularly. Those are the shots that seem to, for the most part, seem to trouble him. Not all the time, but those are the shots that tend to catch Groves' attention, if you will. And that was sort of the case against Rebrassi. There seemed to be a bit of a stumble for Groves in the third or fourth round against Rebrassi, and Rebrassi's not a huge puncher, which could be a troubling sign. He also seemed to tire, which he did in both his meetings with Carl Froch and even to a certain extent against DeGale. When he faced James DeGale early in his career, I believe in 2011, he seemed to show signs of fatigue, and DeGale sort of picked himself back up in that fight and was able to at least finish and make it a close decision. And this seems to be a continued problem for Groves. On the one hand, you look at it and say, okay, well, he still did improve. He didn't taste the canvas. He didn't seem to have any demons. He still seems very full of confidence. There doesn't seem to be an issue in that respect. And you look at it and you say, okay, well, he's improved. He finished the fight on his feet. He finished fairly strong. He threw nearly 1,000 punches, according to the stats. What really can be criticized about that? At the same time, if you look at those stats even, which are not that important, but if you look at them closer, most of those punches were thrown in the first half of the fight. And the rest of the punches that were thrown towards the latter portion of the fight were a lot of jabs, and the power punches that he did throw had a lot less steam on them. I don't know exactly what the issue is with his stamina. Maybe it's in terms of his preparation. Maybe he just does not have the stamina to go 12 very intense or physically demanding rounds. Maybe it has to do with how much steam and zip he tries to put on every single shot, which tends to be the case with a lot of big, bulky guys that have explosive speed/power. It's the same sort of thing that you look at with a guy like Saul Alvarez. Alvarez isn't the fastest puncher in the world, but he does have explosive power, and that sort of bottled up energy bursting out in the first couple of rounds that flame tends to flicker out towards the end of the rounds. And that's the same criticism Alvarez gets a lot of the times, is that he doesn't finish all of his fights as strong as he began them. And this could perhaps be the case with Groves. It also could be just perhaps a shaking of his confidence. Maybe he feels as though he should have gotten certain guys out of there, and when it doesn't happen and he realizes fatigue is beginning to set in, it emotionally or mentally drains him, and it begins to set in even further. It's very difficult to diagnose, obviously, without having, an inside scoop on him or his camp or what have you, but it does nonetheless seem to be a problem. After the fight, I remember listening to an interview with Carl Froch, a man who knows Groves very well. He was being conducted with IFL TV, and he was talking about what he sees in the future for Groves. Now, again, there's no love lost between the two, so there could be a bit of bias in there. Perhaps not. It's inconsequential. He was, at the very least, he was giving his opinion, and whether or not it was biased, I might sort of agree with him, to be totally truthful. He was asked if he thinks Groves will ever win a world title, and he says he thinks he can. The question is, how will he go about it? And I think that's sort of the way it is. I think that's probably right. I don't think that Groves is such a bad fighter that he won't win a world title. There are plenty of them out there. It's not as though it's an impossibility for a guy that does have plenty of talent, some good pop, and at the very least has a very strong fighting spirit. I mean, that right hand that finished him against Froch keeps most fighters down. If it lands that flush with a puncher as hard-hitting as Froch. While he was KO'd in that fight, the fact of the matter is he was up. He did intend to continue. It's a good thing he didn't, but he did intend to continue. And he certainly has all the self-belief one fighter would need. He has tremendous backing with Sauerland Event there. They take care of their fighters, and they have a bona fide star in Grove. Let's make no mistake about it. So they definitely have a prized possession that they're going to guide in the best way they can. So he has the potential there, both in terms of how he'll be handled and also in terms of how he'll be able to handle himself in the ring to win a title. The question you have to ask yourself is, do you see him coming out favorably against the current titleist at 168 pounds? Now, if you're a Grove supporter, certainly. You probably think he has just as good a chance as anyone else, and I don't necessarily disagree with you. He could perhaps beat Arthur Abrahams. He could perhaps beat Anthony Durrell, whom he became the mandatory 2 with his win over Abrasi. It's not out of the question that he beats these guys. That's not at all what I'm saying. He certainly is, at the very least, he's certainly a live dog. The problem, I suppose, if you want to call it that I have, is that it's always going to be a question of, if a right hand lands from a guy like Arthur Abraham, who still packs a bit of a punch, even at super middleweight, or a guy like Anthony Durrell, who can punch and is a pretty sizable 168 pounder in his own right, if they are able to land those sort of right hands that Abrasi landed, what's going to happen? Particularly late in a fight when Groves tends to fade. How does Grove go about fixing these issues, if you will, becomes really the question. Because if you're going to look at it, he has, I think, a better chance of protecting himself from right hands than he does of fixing his stamina issues, if his stamina issues are just simply a part of his genetic code, if you will. There's just no way he can physically improve his stamina. If that's the case, then he obviously has a better chance of improving his defense when it comes to right hands. The problem, I suppose, with that is that it's the age-old argument of, can you teach an old dog new tricks? And the answer to that question has most of the time been, no, you can't. It just doesn't happen. I don't know if it's been ingrained in him so much his style that right hands are just going to be his Achilles heel. It's just going to be what troubles him for the rest of his career. It's, in a certain sense, it's sort of strange that really could be all there is to Groves that potentially stops him from reaching what many considered his potential in the first place. He's, like I said, he's a very talented, very exciting, very dynamic, interesting character in the sport of boxing. There's a lot to him. There's a lot of meat on that bone, if you will. And so it's, in a certain sense, is just a fan. You look at that and you say, I want him to do well because he'll make interesting fights, both in terms of what he's able to do promotion-wise and also in terms of what he brings to the ring in terms of fans. And then, of course, once he gets into the ring, he can be a very exciting fighter in that respect as well. But to always have to worry about that punch or that issue when it comes to his stamina seems to be his biggest problem. It's kind of an interesting one. It's kind of a curious one. Of course, I'd love to hear what you think in terms of how he could potentially correct these issues, or if you think I'm way off the mark and I'm missing it entirely, by all means, go ahead and tell me that. Leave it in the comments, and of course, hit me up on Twitter at 12RounderBoxing. be sure to subscribe and all that great stuff as well. Like and share the video, all that great stuff. In the meantime, or after you're done doing all of those things that I command you do, be sure to click over to part 2, where I'm going to be talking about the November 29th XL show that's going to be taking place in London, Queensberry Promotions. It's very exciting, and it seems to be getting more and more exciting by the day at this point. So be sure to click over part 2. We'll discuss that a little bit, and I'll be giving you a preview of this weekend's upcoming fights. So, check you out there.